This is the epic quest for Shahnameh. Um, and so, yeah, I guess the first question is what happens in the end? And Colleen, you're really the only person of us who knows what happens at the end. So, do you want to tell us?
Yeah, okay. Well, our it's hard to recap it all with the time frame that we have.
Hmm.
Um, but basically it goes through, so like after Rostam, it's pretty much just like a lot of kings and a lot of fighting and a lot of like little stories. Um, so yeah, I would say, I guess like kind of to like sum it up, we have the story of um, Baram, which I picked up kind of halfway through, but I skipped to the beginning of that. And then we have rules. Well, we have a story of Mazdak, who wasn't a ruler, but he was like, I liked him. He was cool. He was kind of like an anarchist. And then Kezra Nushin Raran, rule of Hormozid, rule of Khosrow Parviz, which is a big chunk of the ending. And
Hmm.
then the reign of Yazdegerd.
All right. So, the next question is like, what are major events that the class didn't read? So, I guess I can start off with this one. So, one of the major events that happens in my section is Afrasiab actually finally gets what he deserves after everything he's caused. So basically, he finds this cave and it's like hidden away from every city. And he goes into it and he hides there. And there he just sort of like suddenly regrets his past deeds and wails about it, even though he did a lot of stuff to people. And then this dude named Hum hears him wailing and he gets angry when he finds him. He's like, "You!" He's like, "Oh no, I've been found out." And then, of course, Afrasiab is begging. And he's like, "Well, you should not have shed royal blood. Then you wouldn't have to hide in a cave." But then Afrasiab dives into a lake and disappears. But then Hum gets help, fishes him out, and they hand him over to Iranian kings. And then, of course, Kay Khosrow, the grandson of Kay Kavis, whose father was killed by Afrasiab, ends up getting vengeance by cutting off his head. And then that's the end of him.
So my section is kind of weird. Rostam shows up like, well, actually no, he doesn't show up. He's mentioned once, and that's basically it. It essentially deals with the legend of Sayavash, who kind of functions as like almost another almost another hero, or at least, or maybe not hero, but big main character on Rostam's level, who is born and dies within this span of book. And a couple other people who show up and die, lots of battles, lots of a decent amount of diplomacy going on, some betrayals, it's fun. Afrashab being a coward before he dies, that kind of thing.
I would also, to echo the whole like hero thing, I know, Ryan, I know you read the beginning of Baram Gur, but that's what I thought when I was reading him. He kind of, not that his like he spans like a large chunk of the book, but just like his role and like and his reign kind of like had a lot of like the champion heroic qualities that were kind of seen in Rostam, or just kind of like he really switched it up a lot. So him, and also Khosrow Parviz have like large heroic like tropes that I think were notable. Also, there's like I think China, Byzantine, and India, or I guess just like different countries, come to play a much larger role towards the end. Um, so I mean, it's interesting, especially to see China and India kind of be played as like they weren't portrayed as like the super big bad guys. I mean, of course they were like a threat. They're like a large country, but from like my much larger scope of world history, and then the way it's portrayed in especially the beginning of like sort of the ending, it was interesting to see China and India's role, and then Byzantine and Iran and Persia, and you see all the different countries and their conflicts develop a lot more towards the end.
So I guess the next question he asks is what happens to one main character, but honestly, we go through so many characters that I would just say, and we should rephrase this question, that what happens to one main character from my section, or like that was important or relevant in the previous readings and it still is in our section. So I guess I'll start. So Kay Khosrow, the guy who executes Afrasiab, who is the grandson of Kay Kavas, after he kills Afrasiab, he kind of just he becomes sated with kingship, of course, but then he kind of just starts to like lose his purpose in life because he's already done something he really wanted to do. And so he kind of starts giving up on earthly life after taking revenge. And he basically says, I have a quote here: I have a hidden desire which I long for God to grant me, and what he wants is the ways of righteousness and purity to go to heaven. So it sounded to me like basically he wants to like die, but also not die in like a foolish way, but die nonetheless. So it seemed kind of suicidal. So everyone's like, hey, what's up with this guy? What happened to him? And then Zal and Rostam arrive. Zal tries to talk him out of it, but then they have a talk and he sees, you're not being foolish. This is actually probably a good thing. So surprisingly, he's like, oh, okay. I guess this is fine. So then Kay Khosrow decides to go through with it. He doesn't necessarily like kill himself. He just disappears and no one knows what happens to him. And that's the end of him.
So I've got a Frosty Up in my section right before he dies, and he convinces people he's turned over a new leaf at one point. He gets some advice given to him by a couple new people. He writes Sayavash a letter. He gets cursed once. The more stuff happens, and then at the very end of my section, the historical conflict gets too big, and so Rostam steps in, and Afrasiab runs away, and then Rostam fights him, and then Afrasiab gets beaten in battle, and sends some more letters and such. Yeah, he sends some letters, and my section ends where he wanders, presumably right before he finds his cave and dies.
Yeah.
Yay!
What a life.
Life. I guess that kind of feeds into is that the next question? Some new characters we never got to meet, but totally should.
Yeah.
I mean, there is mention of like Faradan and like the main characters that we all got attached to in like the assigned readings, but obviously they don't like play an active role as much. But I guess some important characters to look out for is, like I've mentioned, Mazdak, who has a very short role, but I liked him a lot, and Baram, like I mentioned. And then I guess the ending, just to kind of like get like better conceptualize how like they kind of wrap up all of the different kings, because it moves kind of fast, is Yazdegerd would be notable as well. But yeah, I can't find, I don't know. I wish some of the characters that like the rest of the class knows about were in my section, so I could talk about them. But
well, yeah, that really ties into our next question, and so I guess I'll start. So one character y'all didn't meet. So there's this guy named Ardashir, and he's kind of extra. Like, so he's the son of a king. He has a prophetic birth and he's destined to rule, and he is a good guy. But for a while, he just kind of goes around and picks fights, like a lot of them, and wins. And they're deserved most of the time, but then other times you're just like, why? And so he's sort of like, he gathers an army and he wages war against Artavan. Artavan is killed. He picks a war with the Kurz. But he's got this beef with this guy named Hothbod, who is a nobleman, and he's got this magic worm, which I'll get into later. And so this dude keeps faring well against his forces because they're all blessed by the worm. So Ardashir is on this journey to. He's called the Unifier because his goal is to make the land become unified and to be a just ruler. So he actually is trying to fall afar. And so he's extra, but he's very entertaining in some ways because you never know what he's going to do next or how he's going to get out of this or what he has up his sleeve in order to become a ruler. So, yeah.
On a somewhat related note, a character I liked, or at least found interesting, I'm not sure like is the right word here, would be Forud. Forud, Sayavash's son. He gets into a lot of fights too, and he starts off winning a decent amount of them. He reminds me a little bit of the Call of Allah's Lemminkainen, and that he really wants to go to war. And his mom is like, wait, no. But he ends up picking fights with a bunch of smaller people anyway, and winning. He fires a wooden arrow that pierces the guy's helmet and pins it to his skull and kills him. And then he fights another guy, and he fights a third guy, and then the third guy finally gets the clue of, oh, hey, this Farood guy is kind of serious. We should probably watch out for him. Fights another guy, so on and so forth, until Farood finally gets his big break in going to war. He goes to war, fights with the Persians, and dies. So that was fun.
After all that.
What a journey.
As he dies, he lay on the ivory couch like a toppled teak tree, his face fair as the full moon.
So I guess we can move on to what is one unexpected, awesome, or funny moment? So I mentioned that dude Hotbod, who is rivals with Ardashir, and he's got this magic worm. So how he gets this magic worm is his daughter is like spinning a wheel, and she takes a bite of an apple, and then just like every children's book ever, there is a worm inside the apple. But she keeps it as a pet for some reason. She's like, oh yay, worm. And then after acquiring the worm, she starts spinning like twice as much wool. And then they start selling wool, and then their family becomes really rich. And then Hafod's like, oh my gosh, this worm, it gave you this gift. It's going to make us rich. And so he starts taking care of this magic worm, and he keeps growing. And so he gives it like its own treasure chest thing to sleep in. And it's like a family pet, but also not, because he actually values the worm more than his daughter at a certain point. Like, the dude's obsessed with this worm. It's literally got its own chamber and everything. I can't make this up. And so, anyways, Ardashir is like, I want to defeat this guy. What's his secret? And then he finds out from some of his men who actually like Ardashir more that he's got a magic worm. And he's like, oh, really? Well, that's convenient. And so what he does is, this worm is now the size of an elephant, and it's got all these caregivers and people that feed him. So he goes in disguise, convinces the caregivers to let him feed the worm. But of course, instead of feeding the worm, what he does is he somehow finds molten hot lava, throws it down the worm's throat, and it dies, and then the whole town is pissed off. And then he executes Hafod and his son, and then he's victorious because he killed the worm.
There you go. That motivated me to read your section. So mission accomplished.
Yeah. I can't top that.
I know.
I have a fight.
Go for it.
Exactly. I have another battle.
Afrasiab fighting Rostam kind of lives up to the hype. I'm not gonna lie. Afrasiab's got a bunch of warriors with arrows that are riding elephants and basically beat Carthage at their own game by a few centuries. Millennia, I don't remember how long. And the sky goes dark and he goes crazy, and then they fight some more. And there's a lot of blood and severed heads and crying out and blades and swords and excitement, and it's fun. Well, sorta.
I guess I can divulge on Mazdak because I've mentioned him every single answer, but haven't given y'all any more information. Let's see, what king is it? Quobat, I think. He like establishes himself. It's just like some random guy who like establishes himself as like the chief minister during like one of the king's reigns. But then, and he becomes like super tight with the king, and then basically tries to like destroy the entire upper class. Like, and this is like in the middle of like an economic crisis, and there's a famine, and a bunch of stuff is going on, and in the midst of it, like it's just this guy who's there, and he's like secretly trying to overthrow them and like dismantle the clergy, and then he eventually gets killed by the person whose success is the king because like they were so great in killing him. But But I just thought it was really fun. We have like a whole Robin Hood subplot going on right there. And then also Baram kills a dragon. I think yeah, in one part of it.
Whoa.
Before the king of India knew that it was him, he killed a dragon and a rhinoceros. He just like kept killing things and bringing back their heads or something like that. So that was cool. It's no pouring lava down a worm's throat though. That was
What is?
what is? Good question.
No, that's still sick though. Killing a dragon? Nice. So the next question is, how is a major theme of the assigned portions developed in the rest of the book? This is kind of obvious, but I think you guys also saw this as well. Far, like, the God-given glory and divine right of a king is still important. Like, in my section, Ardashir has Far. He's quoted as having justice that would make the world flourish once again. And his son, who comes to succeed him, Shapur, also has Far, and he's a benevolent ruler. And so Far is very important still. It still gives kings ability to rule and ability to make good decisions. And this actually leads into your section, Colleen, or like the start of your section. Of course, Far is gone in the reign of Yazdegerd the Unjust, and like he's such a terrible king that his advisors turn against him. And so I've seen in my section that Far is still important and how it passes through rulers.
As I mentioned, I guess like the geography and tension within different kingdoms. Definitely. I mean, it's like a theme throughout the whole epic, but I guess I think that develops a lot. Also, he does, I guess, like not throughout the book, but just kind of like something that we've been like told to keep in mind is like how he wraps it up as kind of like a story to like represent the development of their entire culture. The ending of it is very like he like wraps it up in like a pretty bow kind of, and it's like, oh, it was cute. And Far as well, I saw because it ended with the unjust, and then it was kind of juxtaposed with like, oh, the just king, especially with Baram, especially with the slaying. And he's kind of seen as a character who's like, he's very controlled by his desires. I think there's even an epithet where he's like explained as being like controlled by his pleasures, but at the same time, he's always kind of like stops in his tracks. And there's like a side note where he's like, it's an internal monologue where he's like trying to be just and he's like contemplating what God would want. And like, anyway, basically Far is kind of depicted through his kingship, that even though people see him as a pleasure seeking king, it's like every other like storyline, he's like kind of withdrawing and like having this whole internal debate about like what would be the just and godly and like Far thing to do kind of. So that scene, especially in his story. And then the end, Khosrow Parviz and the End King, lots of like battles. That was some theme that develops, is just fighting pretty much.
Since you've offered themes of history and Far, I will bring up the tropes we've learned about mostly all semester. The extent to which you call it a theme is debatable, but they do come back here. Sayavash kind of gets the whole treatment again. Kavas and some knights are going out one day and they find a maiden, and they basically kind of argue about which knight like she belongs to. Kavas gets her after a bit of flattery, and then the season of spring comes along, and Kavas is told that because he saw the woman, he's gonna have a kid. So voila, there's Sayavash, who becomes the hero of part of my section and fights and writes letters and things. And eventually, where does he die? I can't find where he dies, but he dies at the end of my section. And at the place where he dies, from the place where Sayavash's blood had been spilt, a green tree sprang up. On its leaves, the prince's face could be seen, and its scent was like the scent of musk. It flourished in the winter's cold as freshly as in spring, and it became the place where those who mourned for Sayavash gathered together. And Rostam hears of this and kills the person who betrayed Sayavash in the first place. So, yeah, fun moving image, fun little chronicle that brings those tropes along.
All right, so the last question is, how likely are you to reread this book, and what parts will you reread? So, Colleen, how likely are you to reread this?
Ooh, okay, pretending that I'm somebody who leisurely reads ginormous epics in my free time, like if I had enough time, honestly, I guess maybe I think it would be nice to get like a better comprehensive view of the whole thing just because there are so many different characters.
Mhm.
I think it would be nice to reread it. So in a beautiful world where I have unlimited time and attend the longest attention span that I could possibly dream of, I would definitely reread it because I think it would mean a lot more in terms of like the tropes we've been talking about and like the development of like the historical and like geographical tensions to be able to read it start to finish. And there are also a lot of really interesting like small storylines, and also I like the just like the way that like it's written. I think there's lots of like little parts where I can like really appreciate different. You can tell that it's like, I don't know. It's like nice. I like Reddit. It's one of those things that I would like put in quotes. Like girls would put in quotes and like tattoos. There's lots of like tattooable Pinteresty quotes that you can take out of it and like, you know. So that's why I would say reread it. Reread it for all of the storylines and for a better understanding, but also reread it for all of the tattooable and Pinteresty quotes to like hang up on your wall or like write in cursive, on like the little letters.
Live, fight, die. Instead of live, laugh, love, live, fight, die.
Amen.
What about you, Ryan?
I agree with Colleen in that if money were no object and time were no object, I would probably reread this. I would probably gravitate toward admittedly, yeah, the parts I didn't read. But I do think that Ferdowsi is very good at balancing the larger story and all the large scale battles with, yes, the smaller tales of, what was your guy's name? Mazak?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like him and other people. Yeah, I think I'd be likely to reread it even then at some point down the line.
Yeah, same. I agree with Colleen and you, Ryan. If I had, like you said, unlimited time, and if I wasn't a struggling college student with too much to read already, I'd probably read it. But I'm especially want to read the parts that I didn't, like Ryan said. I want to read the ending because I want to know how it ends. Like Colleen, you did a great job describing it, but I would also like to read to find out who are these people that you speak so fondly of. I want to know too.